It's a blowup that had been brewing for months. Moscow seizing 3 Ukrainian vessels, 2 of them naval ships, after firing across the bow near the new bridge that links annexed Crimea to mainland Russia. It's the very first time since that 2014 takeover of Crimea that the Kremlin has owned up to a direct confrontation with Kiev. It claims the vessels violated, quote, a prohibited area. We're going to piece together what happened and also what happens next. Ukraine's parliament hearing President Petro Poroshenko's call to approve 30 days of martial law, what that means for a country that's scheduled to hold presidential elections next February, and where the incumbent is currently lagging in the polls. The timing is key for both sides. Vladimir Putin's been under sanctions from the West ever since the war started in Ukraine. What's the calculus, both vis-a-vis the European Union and the US-led NATO alliance, and also his own public opinion near the outset of his fourth mandate as president of Russia? Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at the trouble in the Sea of Azov, and we'll be joined from Moscow by Olga Pilova, program assistant at the Russian International Affairs Council think tank. Thank you for being with us here on France 24. Also with us, Anastasia Shapochkinka, who lectures in geopolitics at the French Political Science Institute, Sciences Po. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
Thanks as well to Denis Kolensky, East European of the East European Security Research Initiative Foundation. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
And France 24 Chief International Affairs Editor Robert Parsons. Nice to see you, Rob. The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. Ukraine's parliament convened amid violent demonstrations outside the Russian embassy in Kiev, meetings at the UN Security Council in New York, NATO over in Brussels, all over the Sea of Azov, the Kerch Strait, and a standoff that was bound to happen, say some, ever since Russia annexed Crimea. Nicholas Rushworth explains.
The Kerch Strait, linking the Black Sea and Azov Sea, has been a scene of tension for months. A treaty signed between Ukraine and Russia in 2003 agreed joint control. Tension escalated in 2014 with Russia's annexation from Ukraine of the Crimea Peninsula, which gave Moscow de facto control of both sides of the strait. A strait which is used by all sea traffic from key Ukrainian ports, including Mariupol. Tension ramped up further in May this year with the inauguration of a Russia-built bridge linking Crimea to mainland Russia. The Russian President Vladimir Putin said it was the realization of Russia's historic ambitions. Russia this year began inspecting all vessels sailing through the strait, part of what Kiev says is a creeping blockade. Moscow said it did so after Ukraine detained a trawler from Crimea. The hit to the Ukrainian economy has been significant. Ukrainian media report Mariupol and Berdyansk saw earnings fall by almost a quarter during the first 7 months of this year. Kiev says another of the problems it's facing is that larger Ukrainian ships cannot pass through the Kerch Strait bridge's arches.
Now, back in March, Ukraine detained a fishing vessel traveling from Crimea. Then Russia beefed up its presence and started inspecting ships traveling to or from Ukrainian ports. So I guess, Anastasia, we'll start with the question. Who started it?
I think that to understand better the situation, we have to step back a little bit in history, because this escalation is not a new thing in itself. It's rather a continuation of an escalation which has already happened before. In 2003, the Russians have started building not a bridge but an embankment all from the Russian territory all the way up to an island which belongs to Ukraine, and that construction was already perceived as the first step of a possible escalation. Ukraine was against it, and only due to negotiations between then President Kuchma and President Putin, the construction stopped 100 meters away from the island.
And this was off the Kerch Strait.
Exactly, and the same escalation, and the sentiment that was anticipating a military escalation following this construction already took place in 2003. As a result of that, three treaties resulted from that. One was the Treaty of Territorial Integrity of Ukraine, which would actually expose and make sure that it was clear and both sides understood exactly where the border went, especially at sea. And the other, the treaty which built on that, was the treaty which is evoked today very often in the media about the use of the territorial waters and of the Kerch Strait and of the Azov Sea between Russia and Ukraine. That treaty says that these waters belong to both states. Back in the Soviet times, these waters belonged to the Soviet Union.
And the annexation of Crimea, does that change that treaty?
That's the thing, that the treaty hasn't been renegotiated since the annexation of the Crimea. However, it's based on two other treaties, the treaty about the use of Azov and the Kerch Strait. First is this Territorial Integrity of Ukraine Treaty of 2004, which, of course, by de facto has changed after the annexation of the Crimea, but also on the 1997 Treaty of Friendship between Russia and Ukraine, which, again, de facto doesn't have any ground anymore. However, the treaty itself has not been renegotiated.
Dennis Kolesnik, did you see this coming?
It was from the very annexation of Crimea, it was pretty much obvious that Russia would try to escalate. At the beginning, we saw a huge militarization of the peninsula. Russia created the A2AD bubbles on this peninsula to prevent actually the use of the Ukrainian aviation. And since they started to build this bridge, it was even more obvious that it will be used to choke Ukraine's access and to prevent Ukraine's navigation.
So why do it? I mean, after all, it's a bit of a mismatch. If ever there was a real naval battle, there's no points for guessing who would win.
Yes, definitely. Ukraine has lost, let's say, up to 80% of its naval vessels. So the fleet basically isn't here.
So
except
why does Russia feel threatened enough so that?
I do not think that Russia was feeling threatened. I mean, if you accept the whole Russian narrative, it is about Russia being a victim of a Western aggression and an evil West or NATO going against Russia. But in this particular case, I cannot say that Russia can be threatened by the Ukrainian military. The problem is that this situation, in my point of view, could be used or is used actually by Kremlin to demonstrate the power and to say, we are here, we can do it. We don't care actually about the international law because, as our colleague here mentioned, the treaties haven't been negotiated. The annexation of Crimea hasn't been accepted by the international community. So de jure, it's the territory of Ukraine. And the treaty as well allows both countries to use the Strait Kerch and the access to the Azov Sea with no problems.
The distress call on Sunday came just outside of the Crimean waters, 0.9 kilometers outside, reports the Daily Telegraph's Alec Lun over Twitter. And that pinpoint was quite precise thanks to geolocalization. You can see it there on that tweet, that on the map where it was exactly, just south of where the bridge is. Robert Parsons, was it Russia picking a fight, or has it been brewing for a long time?
I think pretty much so. I agree with both the points you've been making. I think the essential aim, I think, of the Russians is to put pressure on Ukraine, to make Ukraine feel that it is a junior partner in this relationship, that Russia can squeeze the screw whenever it wants to. Russia understands perfectly well just how important it is for Ukraine to have access to those ports of Mariupol and Berdyansk. 25% of Ukraine's exports go through the Straits of Kerch into the Black Sea and thence to Turkey and elsewhere in the world and to the rest of Ukraine. It's vitally important for the Russians. It's not about whether the Russians feel of course the Russians don't feel threatened by the tiny Ukrainian navy. It's making a point. Yeah, and the nonsense that we heard from Sergey Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, talking about the threat to Russia's integrity, as the point we've just heard being made now, if it's a question of sovereignty, that really, Russia has no sovereignty in international law over Crimea. So that's really not the issue either.
Let's listen to Sergey Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister. He's been reacting. The Russian president so far has been silent.
Key norms of international law have been violated, not only maritime law, but also the general international law. We don't have any doubt that this was done with the knowledge of Ukrainian authorities and was probably a direct order from the highest level of government. I think we haven't yet seen everything in terms of the consequences of yesterday's provocation.
So there was this tanker that had been positioned to block the Kerch Strait at the foot of the bridge. That's now been moved. What do you make of that?
All part of the same thing. We heard in that report, one of the things about this bridge is that its maximum height is 33 meters. Now, that's much lower than would normally be the case for bridges of this kind. It makes it impossible for certain kinds of shipping to get through. This is all about putting pressure on Ukraine, and absolutely nothing. It's a red herring, this whole business about the threat to Russian integrity, the threat to Russian sovereignty. We've heard it many times before from the Russians in different episodes. To suggest, that Russia is the victim in this situation is frankly absurd.
All right, we seem to have fixed the issues we had technically with Moscow. So we're able to cross now to Olga Pilova, Program Assistant at the Russian International Affairs Council think tank. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate. Are you surprised by this flare-up, and why now?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you properly. Can you probably repeat the question?
Are you surprised that we have this flare-up with between Russia and Ukraine?
I'm not actually surprised because, as our international affairs minister said, it was just. I'm sorry, something wrong. As he said, it was absolutely normal, as everyone understood that something like that would be happening right now. So it's not a surprise for us, probably. And we strongly believe that this situation is a provocation of Ukrainians. So that we should probably ask them to work on something they're doing right now, because the situation is coming out of the control, and everything that's happening right now is very bad for the relations between countries.
So it's a Ukrainian provocation, you're saying. Why now?
Yes, definitely.
Why is this happening now, in your view?
Well, I think that it's happening because of the situation in Ukraine, because of the elections, because of the elections, the upcoming elections in March 2019. So that's probably important for the president, and that's probably important for the for him, because he wants victory. So because of this situation, he will probably get more votes. That's why it's happening.
That's why it's happening now. A bit of issues with the sound with Moscow. Apologies for that. Anastasia Shapochenko, is this a win-win by the sound? Is this what some analysts are saying? A win for Putin because he can show his strength, and a win for Poroshenko, who can get people to rally around the flag, and as we head towards the presidential election campaign.
I think that it's a win for neither. For Putin, it's very difficult to support the stand of Russia being a victim and to truly portray it as a credible position, given that there are dozens of true upgraded brand new military ships in the Black Sea and the Kerch Strait, which belong to the Russian state today. And there were exactly 2 military ships which traveled from Odessa to Mariupol in September. There were 2 on their way, and these were the ships which we saw on TV. They don't look neither upgraded nor new, and that makes a total of 4 military ships plus a tugging boat, which had to be used to tug one of the military ships. So in that situation, to portray Russia as an underdog is very, very complicated. Rather makes a laughingstock out of Russia, which must make the element of fun for the people to prepare the UN Security Council meetings.
But you say
Ukraine,
that. But public opinion likes a win. I mean, remember when the United States invaded tiny Grenada, it was a complete mismatch, and yet the U.S. public opinion backed Ronald Reagan because it was a win.
It's a good point. I think that the win for Crimea has already been made. You cannot win it more than once. But the tough stance of Putin is definitely bringing him points. And today, inside of Russia, if we consider Russian foreign policy as a vector of the internal policy, inside of Russia, Putin may need those points because after the pension reform, his ratings went down. On the other hand, a lot of analysts in Russia consider that Putin doesn't really care about his ratings because he considers himself above any ratings. As opposed to Poroshenko, who indeed cares about his ratings and who doesn't come first or second in the presidential race for Ukraine. However, this situation, representing again Ukraine as an underdog and also rallying all the international support that he does receive due to the situation, I don't think it will help him personally at in the election.
It won't help him
in the electoral race, no, because of the rest of the record of Poroshenko inside the country.
Denis Kolesnik, you agree?
I would say that yesterday evening, when President Poroshenko announced his decision actually to introduce the martial law in Ukraine, I was pretty much astonished because, first of all, if this decision was necessary, it should have been done, let's say, in 2015 or 2014. But I cannot see the logic applying it now, and still we cannot speak about the application of the martial law since the parliament hasn't yet voted for it. So let's say I believe there is some negotiations ongoing between different political parties now in the Ukrainian parliament. Actually, Poroshenko said that he would like to extend only to 30 days. The martial law instead of 60 he mentioned previously, but at the same time, to be honest, it is difficult for me to see how could actually he can benefit from it. Okay, there is some within some part of population in Ukraine there is this hardliner stance saying that okay, we have to, let's say, break diplomatic relations with Russia, we have to introduce a martial law. It exists, but at the same time, will it give really the points to Poroshenko? I'm not sure.
I rather agree with that. I think, of course, it's not beyond Ukraine and Petro Poroshenko to act provocatively towards Russia. I mean, I'm sure if the Ukrainian president saw an opportunity for him to exploit, he wouldn't be against trying to do it. But in this particular circumstance, I just don't see what the benefit is.
Why ask for martial law, though?
Well, tell me two separate things. What is the calculation when you're sending 3 dilapidated boats from one Ukrainian port to another Ukrainian port, which is following a path that's been followed many times before? Why would you anticipate a Russian response of this strength, which would then give you the opportunity to go to the Ukrainian people and say, look how terrible the Russians are, we have to stand and be strong, we have to have martial law, possibly we have to put off the elections. For me, it just doesn't add up as a scenario. Martial law, I think, at the moment, perhaps is an opportunity for Poroshenko to show that he's strong. Coming up, as you pointed out, to the election campaign next year, he's doing extremely badly in the polls. He needs to show that he's the man in control. But the fact that he's not going for the 60-day option and going instead for a 30-day option shows that he's not putting the elections paramount in his concerns at the moment.
All right, we're going to pick up on that point when we come back. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate. Russia annexed Crimea back in 2014, but now for the very first time, the Russians talking openly about a standoff. It happened just off of Crimea, near the Kerch Strait on Sunday. 23 Ukrainian sailors being held by Russia. With us from Moscow, Olga Pilova, Program Assistant at the Russian International Affairs Council. Welcome back. Welcome back as well to Anastasia I'll get it right. Shapochkina, there we go, who teaches at the French Political Science Institute, Sciences Po. Denis Kolesnik of the East European Security Research Initiative Foundation.
You can get my name right.
I think so. Robert Parsons, France 24's Robert Parsons, who before the break was downplaying the criticism of Petro Poroshenko as to whether or not this was a provocation of his doing. Ukraine's president, who, as Dennis was mentioning earlier, having his ambitions for martial law from 60 to 30 days and insisting this will no way, he says, impede on next February's presidential election campaign.
As President and Commander-in-Chief of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, I fulfilled my constitutional obligation a few hours ago. By decree, I imposed martial law on the whole territory of Ukraine, starting at 9 a.m. on November 28th. Russia has waged a hybrid war against our state for 5 years, but by attacking Ukrainian military ships, it has reached the next level.
Robert, again, the question, though, why the need to impose martial law if throughout the whole conflict he's never done it before?
Well, I think it's what we were talking about at the end there. Poroshenko is a weak leader. He's coming up to elections. His rating is very low. He needs to do something, but he knows there's not an awful lot that Ukraine can realistically do in the face of such a powerful opponent. But he wants to do something. He wants to show he's tough. He wants to show he's in control. And I think it's really about that. He just wants to show that he really is the man in charge and that he's not entirely powerless. There are things he can do. And he's turning to the Ukrainian people, really, I think, and say, look, I'm doing my best in the situation. It may not be very much. We all understand the nature of the relationship between Ukraine and Russia. But in the circumstances, it's something that we have to do.
Anastasia Shapochkina, our correspondent in Kiev, saying to us earlier that under the circumstances, with what's happened, yes, he has been able to rally a bit of support in the past 24 hours, it seems.
Definitely would probably serve raising the rating a little bit. However, looking at where campaign is and how it's coming, Tymoshenko is number one in the so far in the polls, but number two is a comedian. And so far, when we've seen comedians run against incumbent politicians, like it happened in Iceland, they tend to win. And this particular comedian is very popular because he launched a series about a school teacher becoming Ukrainian president. So it'd be very ironic if he actually does win the election. Poroshenko comes far behind. And this one-time incident is not going to, I don't think it's going to propel him all the way back to the presidential seat back in March during the elections.
Dennis Kolesny?
So I have two things to say here. First of all, I actually agree with another guest here. I believe that actually yesterday Poroshenko with his war cabinet, they were analyzing their options, and there was none. Since Ukraine is not a member state, there is no real security assurances. Ukraine has practically no military capabilities. Ukraine cannot really use the aviation, which means the options are pretty non-existent. So he decided, as another intervenant here was saying, that he decided to show himself tough, that he is reacting. He's a head of a state, so he had to react. Another issue is that whatever he does, there will be a backlash. I mean, there will be Moscow will definitely use this in order to create the narrative. And in Ukraine as well, other political parties not supporting bloc of Petro Poroshenko, they will be also creating and criticizing him. So I don't really think that he actually won. Maybe in a short run, he will actually receive, or he has already received some boost in his ratings, but in the longer run, no, I don't think so.
Lots of reactions on the hashtag F24 debate. Russia keeps doing this sort of stuff, says Trevor, to see how far the West will budge or react. At some point, we need to push back, or the Russians will ride roughshod over the Baltic states and Ukraine, and possibly a few others too. Yeah, viewers divided over this incident, some expressing criticism of the past Western strategy of sanctions. And there was this other reaction, and I'll read it to you, Olga Pilova. It's from the outgoing United States ambassador to the United Nations. Nikki Haley saying, as President Trump has said many times, the United States would welcome a normal relationship with Russia, but outlaw actions like this one continue to make this impossible. Your thoughts?
I'm sorry, is again something wrong with the with my computer probably, or connection. Can you repeat the question?
Sure. The U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, Nikki Haley, denouncing what she calls outlaw actions like this one, which continue to make a good relationship between Russia and the United States impossible. Your thoughts on the reaction in general of the West?
I'm not sure that this will affect the relations between Russia and the West dramatically, because nowadays relations between them are not that great, probably. That's why I think that Russia and the US and the West, I mean the European Council and European Union, should probably stop paying attention to provocations like this in order to develop their relations and not to bring the house to them.
We're seeing that here. There's a sort of a backlash against sanctions here in the West and here in France from the right-wing opposition, but also
there has been, and in Italy as well. We've seen it, and Hungary, another example. But this is going to have the opposite effect, I think. And actually, it was interesting to hear the Russians speaking earlier today about this possibility, calling this a provocation which was intended to have the backlash of more sanctions being put on Russia. I don't think this is any sort of provocation. I think the Russians have shot themselves in their own foot here. But I do think that one consequence of it will be that the mood inside Europe in particular, but also in the United States, on softening sanctions will change now. It wasn't present in many countries. It was barely present in France. The UK, obviously, very strong on sanctions. Germany is still strong on sanctions. But I think the mood will turn against softening sanctions as a consequence of this, at least for the next few months.
And would sanctions make any difference at this point?
Well, I do think they make a difference. The Russian economy has really suffered as a consequence. And we were talking about President Putin's popularity rating falling for the first time. One of the reasons for that is pensions policy. But one of the reasons why he's changing his pensions policy is because of the need for more income to come into the state coffers. These things are all linked together. And I think, when Putin looks at his popularity ratings and sees that, he has to make a calculation. Will this make me more popular? Or is the Russian population already growing tired of this sort of constant confrontation with the outside world, the West in particular? My feeling about it is that there's something of a sea change beginning to happen inside Russian society at the moment. There was a period when this aggression worked really well, because of that sort of sense that the Russian people or the Russian state had been humiliated, that it was time for Russia to push back and be strong and tough. I think that really works. But I think we've reached the peak of that now. It's beginning to slide down. People want to live well, first of all. And all they've seen over the last 4 or 5 years is declining living standards.
Olga Pilova, we've talked about Petro Poroshenko, who in this crisis has one eye towards the presidential elections that are coming up in Ukraine. Do you agree with Robert Parsons that Vladimir Putin has one eye on the discontent over that pensions reform, that has his eye on domestic issues in all this? Olga Pilova, can you hear us?
Yeah, right now, yes.
Yeah, I was asking you, for Vladimir Putin, is it also about domestic issues? Is it also the discontent at home and the need to rally people around the flag at a time when there is disgruntlement, in particular over this pension reform?
I'm not sure. Right. Sorry, is something wrong with the connection?
We can hear you loud and clear.
I can hear clearly.
All right, we'll try to fix the connection with Moscow. Anastasia Shapchotkina, is it really in the calculus then? You were saying that earlier about.
Again, this is one of the views if we look at Putin's aggressive action that Putin's taken in his foreign policy in recent history. We saw that that coincided in time, at least, with a domestic crisis in 2004, before the Orange Revolution, and then the reaction of Russia to that with the gas crisis. That was the tragedy in Beslan in 2008, in addition to the Bucharest summit and the proposal of the membership action plan to Ukraine and Georgia. There was also the financial crisis and the falling of the oil price. In 2014, again, there was the oil price, which coincided with sanctions. And that's why it's so difficult today to separate the effect of one or the other, especially since today the oil price has reached a new low. However,
the oil price has tanked. We were saying it was going to $90, and now it's south
60,
of 60.
Yes, it's 60, south of 60, exactly. Yeah. And what Robert was saying just right now, I agree with that also in a sense that in Russia itself, there is on the one hand Ukraine fatigue, just as much as there is in the Western society, and also there is a new generation of people who were born in the 2000s who are now reaching their 18th anniversary and who we've seen already demonstrating earlier in the year in different cities in Russia. And those two factors, they make this narrative and more warmongering less attractive.
All right, and we talked about the reaction of the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, Nikki Haley, saying this is the opinion of the United States of America. Now, I've got in front of me here Donald Trump's Twitter feed, and he's opined on a lot of issues this Monday, but not this. Your thoughts on that?
As American, I am happy to pronounce my thoughts on that. Donald Trump has been in a direct confrontation with some members of Congress and also with the investigation committee of the Special Prosecutor General Robert Mueller over Russia. For him, it is difficult to pronounce himself on the controversial issues like Russia, and because he's been favorable to Russia as a person, he's personally voiced
but he hired
praise toward Putin.
He hired John Bolton to be his national security advisor, this very hawkish
also very anti-UN and very anti-international law, which basically brings us to the point when Trump has more points in common with Vladimir Putin, such as respect for force as opposed to rules, respect for authority, for authoritarian way of treating things, and also they have a personal rapport which is undeniable, and which brings him in confrontation with American institutions, which today keep leading the investigations into his.
Which brings us back to what Robert Parsons was saying earlier, which was that you have NATO allies coming together over this issue. You have European Union partners coming together. Is it really the case, or is the current climate more favorable to Putin when you see divisions within Europe over sanctions, for instance?
Actually, that's what Russia has been doing for quite a time. It was actually the measures aimed at the destruction and sowing dissent within the European Union and NATO. Because it is obvious, if you have, let's say, Hungary, who has been blocking Ukraine, NATO-Ukraine Council for a number of months. You have in other issues, it's like migration. So for them, for Ukrainians, I believe they are left alone and they understand it pretty well. But few people actually are courageous enough to say it within the Ukrainian society and within the expert society. And the question is what to do. Whether Ukraine should cease, I don't know, accept Russian conditions, or I believe within the core of the Ukrainian political elites there is a discussion what to do, because they understand there is no chance for them to get into NATO. The chance has been missed in 2008, the Bucharest summit. And actually, if we come back to that crucial date, it's when all of this started. Russia aggressed Georgia, received basically no response. Moscow saw it as a green light with the further moves. For instance, in 2008, I believe a few Ukrainian experts actually wrote and urged that the next aim of Russia will be Crimea. And actually, what we have observed.
Yeah, so we have. You've had, since Vladimir Putin has been, now it's been what, nearly 20 years, right? That he's been president or prime minister, that he's been inside the Kremlin. You've had Georgia, you have the low-level amount of simmering fighting that's still going on between Russian-backed separatists and the Ukrainian army in eastern Ukraine, Robert Parsons. And there are others who are nervous, like in Moldova, for instance. When you think back, though, it's been 4.5 years since those little green men popped up in Crimea. It all just seems kind of frozen.
Well, I wouldn't put it that way. I think from a Russian perspective, it's not really frozen at all. They're consolidating their position. The construction of that bridge that we've been talking about from mainland Russia across the Kiev Straits to Crimea is more than just a symbol. It represents real Russian power inside the Crimean Peninsula. They've also been reinforcing Crimea militarily. So politically, militarily, economically, they've moved pretty fast. But it was interesting what we were just talking about now. But I was in Georgia in 2008 at the time of the invasion then by the Russian army and spoke to the Georgian president, Mikhail Saakashvili. He made exactly that point. He said, it's Georgia today, but you can be absolutely sure the next target after us is going to be Crimea.
But you've just been saying that there's this fatigue when it comes to all of these conflicts. So what is the strategy in 2018, nearly 2019 for Vladimir Putin when it comes to these states that border Russia?
Well, I'm not sure that strategy is top of President Putin's mind at the moment. He's been in power an awful long time. I think he's beginning to run out of ideas about how to push the country forward. He's been through that period of enormous growth, fantastic success, largely as a consequence of the high oil price, it is true. But in terms of his own standing with the Russian people, it was an amazingly successful people in which he was able to consolidate. He's been through this phase now of Russian aggression in foreign policy. And the country is beginning to tire of it, as I was suggesting earlier on. But I don't really see that Putin has got very much as an alternative to that. At the moment, I get the impression that he's scrabbling around or not particularly concerned about it. He's been in power a long time. His main concern is to stay on in power and to make sure that there's no internal threat. Hence his concern about people like Navalny, for instance, that there should not be an internal opposition. His main concern at the moment is not to make Russia stronger, not to make Russia richer, although, of course, he's not against those things. His main concern at the moment, I think, is to consolidate his power and make sure that there are no internal threats to his position.
Anastasia Shapochenko, when he was reelected back in the spring, we were in Moscow, and there were advisors telling us, you'll see, there's going to be a shakeup in the cabinet this time. A renewal of the generation. We still have Medvedev as prime minister. It seems like there hasn't been that big shakeup. Why?
If we want to think of a shakeup, I think that where the Russians saw it was in the governors' seats. So in different oblasts and regions in Russia, there was maybe a dozen or even more governors who were fired, because that's how it works, by the Kremlin, and then new people were positioned. And the new people indeed represent a newer generation. Not to say that the old generation people weren't dependent 100% on the Kremlin. However, some of them came to tarnish the party and be a liability. And the new people for sure will owe everything to the president. There would be no question about previous political links, local connections, or business ties. They would owe everything to Putin. And around Putin as well, maybe not in the cabinet, but in the second tier, you also saw some changes and some new faces.
And if I may, actually, I would like to say one thing. What we observe since at least 2008 is that Russia is spreading. I mean, there was a Georgia campaign, seizure of Crimea, annexation of Crimea. Russia is currently a dominant power in Syria. There are some negotiations with Sudan. Russia impeded on the Western interest in Central African Republic, for instance. There is some activities of the Russian special operations forces in eastern Libya. I mean, I agree that indeed Putin wants to stay in power, but at the same time, today...
So you're saying it's an expansionist
yes, and
policy?
It's not Yes, and actually today it was quite interesting to hear to the Russian representative to the UN Security Council, and he was quite clear. He said that Russia wants another world, not the world we had before, but the world, the multipolar world, where Russia will have its own. He didn't say that. I mean, I'm not quoting him, but the message was clear. Russia wants to have its status, power, and some zone of influence.
So it comes back to the old, which is what we discussed back in 2014, which Russia, and some would say very legitimately, feels disrespected.
It was a narrative created in Russia since, during the Soviet times they were using the same narrative. Since the dissolution of the USSR, they started to use the same narrative. I mean, there is basically an information warfare, and it's a whole big concept actually what's going on that includes a lot of things like cyber operations, information warfare, information operations, fake news, espionage, etc. But it is really another subject for another.
No, we saw with the missile defense shields, which the U.S. administration of then President George W. Bush said were not at all for to counter Moscow, and yet was being set up in Eastern Europe.
Eastern Europe is a part of NATO. They are member NATO states, and to be honest, I do not see any problem from the legal point of view of doing something. And basically, what Russia achieved is that currently Poland asks the United States to create a permanent military base on the Polish soil.
Yes, I mean, the fact of the world today is that it is multipolar, and in a sense that is Russia's achievement, but only partially. You know, China's played a very important part in that as well, obviously, a much bigger role, in fact, than Russia. But Russia's problem has been and will be for some considerable time, unless Russia changes its policy, is that it's never going to shake off that disrespect that it feels from the rest of the world until it develops soft power. And Russia has no soft power projection at all in the world. China does, but Russia doesn't.
Robert, you say that, but when we've had done on this very set discussions about Syria, people saying, "Oh, Russia's got a plan, the West doesn't." A lot of times, it seems like Russia is a diplomatic giant.
But what's Russia going to do to deal with the Syrian
instances.
economy when everybody starts talking about reconstruction? Russia doesn't have a plan for the regeneration of Syria. It's already talking about the European Union paying the cost, paying the bill. Russia itself is not in a position to do that.
I completely agree with your statement.
The only possible exception to that would be the use of the Russian language. That is a big tool of soft power today. If we think about giant Russian communities in New York or in Germany being entirely brainwashed with the Russian propaganda, TV, via the internet, and also the people who live in the post-Soviet space also being targeted by that, and successfully, including young people, including people who have not been born or grown up in the Soviet Union. That's why I'd say that is a powerful exception, as well as RT and the possibilities to the attempts to kind of spread the influence via media in this way. But the Russian language is a soft power tool. Is an exception to the rule.
Anastasia Shapchatin, I want to thank you. I want to thank as well Denis Kolesnik, Robert Parsons. I want to thank as well Olga Pilova for joining us from Moscow. Thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate. We're going to continue to monitor the situation there between Russia and Ukraine on our website, france24.com.